All right, everybody, welcome back, and here we go again. Um, so we ended up the last video. We ended with Russian strike aircraft trying to put the hurt on this well-detected American Task Force Ranger and getting shot to pieces by the Tomcats, and what few missiles those strike aircraft were able to launch were all felled by American surface-to-air missile defenses. So that was a bad moment for the Russians. And then what happened after that was we had the sub on patrol. We sent a maritime patrol aircraft to patrol this sea zone here, and that aircraft being there is going to become relevant in this action. But before that, I want to follow up and clarify a little bit about combat air patrol and how that functions to intercept airstrikes, because it's going to happen again in a minute, actually. So when an enemy air unit enters a sea zone where carriers at sea have fighters flying combat air patrol, that combat air patrol can engage the enemy aircraft. That also includes if enemy carriers with their own fighters on combat air patrol move into the same sea zone, they have a little combat there. So in our example from the previous video, the Soviets sent two elements of strike aircraft against the United States, and that allows the combat air patrol to try to defend the task force. The Tomcats from each task force got to attack because there were two Soviet strike aircraft, and so a maximum of two different fighters flying combat air patrol are allowed to attack, even though only one of the task forces was the target of the Russian attack. If the Soviets had sent only a single aircraft on the attack, then only one of the American fighters would have been able to respond. If the Soviets were to send three aircraft into the zone and the Americans had three carriers, they would be able to all fire, or the Americans might just only shoot two. So I hope that makes sense. I also should mention the way combat air patrol on land facilities works. Um, in this game, you don't station fighters on combat air patrol. If they're on an airfield, they're assumed to be flying cap, and it's because these turns are 2 days long. So it's you know you're not going to manage every liftoff and landing of different combat air patrol units. If they're there, they're flying cap. Aircraft that are on a facility will fly combat air patrol only for attacks against that facility. Aircraft that are flying combat air patrol in a sea zone, so from a task force, will attack any air unit that enters that sea zone for whatever reason. So the combat air patrol will defend a missile attack against the UK bases if it comes from this sea zone here. And if the Soviets send multiple different strikes in at different times, the combat air patrol in the sea zone will respond every time. But the only way that the land-based fighters will respond as combat air patrol is if their specific facility is attacked. There is another way for these air units to interdict enemy strikes, and that is for these fighters to be placed on patrol, similar to maritime patrol aircraft. If you have a fighter on patrol, when an aircraft enters this sea zone, with any kind of aircraft for any reason, the interceptors have a chance to engage and potentially destroy it. So just because we're on this topic, I'm going to give you a little example of this. So let's say Soviets were in this configuration and NATO had a fighter out here on patrol in the sea zone and two combat air patrols. If the Soviets sent this strike unit here, the first thing that would happen is this interceptor would engage. If the interceptor shoots it down, then it's gone. No problem. If the interceptor misses it badly, then the strike unit just continues on. If the interceptor misses, but misses only by 1 pip, then the strike unit is considered detected, and it makes it an easier target for the cap. He's sort of like, yeah, we engaged this strike package. We couldn't kill any of them, but they're coming your way, and the cap gets ready. And then the cap would engage, as we did in the previous video. So those units are dead. So I hope that makes sense. Questions, comments, whatever, put them in the comments, whatever. This fighter is not on patrol in this zone. So that is sort of talking a little bit more about combat air patrol and interception. When you put a land-based unit on patrol in the sea zone, it is on an intercept mission. You can also use fighters to escort airstrikes. We will be seeing that happen in later videos. Okay, so now if you look at the ops track, we left off the last time as the ship's action. Again, anytime both operations markers are on or below one of these events happen. So the United States sent this patrol aircraft into the Norwegian Sea, lowered their ops to 7, and now that triggers a ship's action. That happens before any further actions are taken that use operations points. Good news, I said in an earlier video that the ship's action is not detailed in any way on a player aid, and I was wrong. On what I'm calling the gray player aid action and turn sequences, there is a very good description of the ship's action. So here we go. The ship's event or action, it's an event. The ship's event happens in 6 steps. The first step is movement. All task forces are going to move before the second step happens. All task forces that have good detection markers will move first. If both sides have task forces in any given detection category, the Soviets always move theirs first. So there are no good detected Soviet task forces. There is a good detected American task force. That's right here. It's now this task force's chance to move. It's not going to move. It doesn't think that coming into the Norwegian Sea and getting just bombarded by submarine attacks by all these units is a very wise idea. So it's going to hang back here and do nothing. There is no enemy submarine to engage in this sea zone. Now, they certainly would if they could. They're already good detected. They couldn't lose anything. So now we go to poor detection. There are none. And now we go to undetected task forces, and they will now take their turns. The Soviets move first, and so the Soviets have a task force here. It's got the amphibious units. One of the things that happens when a task force moves, a task force is allowed to have one single submarine attached to it. It has to be a nuclear submarine. When a task force moves from a zone with a fresh submarine, a nuclear submarine, it can attach that submarine to itself and add it to the task force. Similarly, if it moves into a sea zone that has a nuclear submarine, it can add that submarine to itself, if that makes sense. So the Soviet task force is going to move here. It could bring one of these nuclear, this is a diesel, it couldn't bring that. It could bring one of these nuclear submarines along with it as part of it, included in the task force, or it could take the November and join the November up. It can't take the Diesel Foxtrot. So the November is, kind of a cruddy, on the cruddy side for nuclear submarines for the Soviets, but it does give a good bonus in protection against submarine attacks. So the Soviet task force is going to go ahead and have that submarine join up with it. All right. Now a bunch of things are happening here. The Soviet task force has moved into a sea zone where there is an aircraft on patrol and a submarine on patrol. Either one of those on patrol units has the option of interrupting the task force's movement and either detecting it or attacking it. The problem for NATO is that this on patrol submarine cannot attack the task force if it hasn't already been detected, and it's not detected yet. But this maritime patrol aircraft is allowed, if it wants, to make an attempt at detecting this task force. But before that happens, you'll notice that this task force here has fighters. Whenever fighters move into a sea zone with enemy aircraft, combat occurs. So this is going to be another example of combat air patrol fighters versus maritime patrol aircraft. Okay, so these yaks are going to now engage these Atlantiques and try to drive them off before they can get a detection. The yaks roll 1 dice in the best of times, and so that's what they're going to roll, and they're going to try to shoo the Atlantique away. And here we go with that. A 2. And so a 2 is a pretty big miss, so the Atlantique is not injured. But again, if you refer to your player aid, your aircraft attacked by fighters, cabin interceptors, you can sort of look at that and verify that I'm telling you the truth. You need a 9 or greater to impede the search ability of that plane. So the yaks, they're short range. They just couldn't get out there and do anything to scare the Atlantiques away. Now, the Atlantique is allowed to interrupt this task force movement and make a detection attempt. The Atlantique has a single search die for task force detection, and sorry, I faded that off, and 3 for anti-submarine warfare. So it's rolling only 1 die here, attempting to detect the Soviet task force. And that is a 7. And so if you refer to your player aid, the blue player aid, where it says task forces detection and whatnot, a roll of 6 to 8 allows you to place a poor detection marker, and it allows the rolling player to choose if there are more than 1 task force. In this case, there's only 1. If there was an already existing poor detection marker, the rolling player would have the option of upgrading one of those poor detections to a good detection. In this case, the Atlantique did its job. It's got a general location on Task Force Andropov. It has used itself up. It's going to fly back to base, and it's going to be marked spent. So it's been used. It can't fly. It can't be used for another action until it gets refreshed, which will happen very soon, as a matter of fact. Okay, so we've done all that. Now, in an earlier video, I had a maritime patrol craft or a marine patrol craft fly a search mission for a task force, and with a successful detection, it was allowed to then trigger a follow-on attack. I'm not certain about this, but I believe that that does not apply to aircraft that are on general patrol. It only applies to aircraft that are specifically sent out to search. And I believe that because if you're the commander and you're saying, we think there's a task force out there, we want to hit it with an airstrike, go find it for us. You send out a patrol to find the task force, and you've got an airstrike waiting. But if you just have aircraft on patrol flying around, you're just saying, look, if something happens, let us know. You don't have aircraft loaded up and ready to go in case that particular patrol finds something. So the on-patrol aircraft did find the task force, but NATO is going to have to expend actions and operations points to launch an attack against it at this point, which they will be doing shortly. But we have to finish the ship's action first. So the Soviets moved their, what was at the time undetected task force, and did what it's going to do. And so it has finished its movement section, and so now NATO has an undetected task force, and that task force similarly is going to stay put. It doesn't see any benefit in trying to sneak across this line here. Thinks that's probably a mistake. So now, not that the Soviets don't have a chance to send these subs down after it, right? But it doesn't need to get any closer to them than it already is. So the step 1 of the ship's action, task force movement, is completed. As previously, if a task force chooses not to move, it may conduct anti-submarine warfare. There are no relevant submarines in this sea zone for these task forces to attack. Also, if a task force with amphibious units, or convoys in NATO's case, that's for the campaign game, if it begins its ship's action in a sea zone adjacent to a landing marker, right here, it can initiate an amphibious invasion. But the Soviet task force just moved in this turn, so at the next ship's action, it will have the option of launching an invasion of Trondheim, which it will do, because that is its objective, is to capture Trondheim. So now we move on to step 2, degrade detections not placed in step 1. So the poor detection on the Soviet task force was placed in step 1, so that just stays where it is. The good detection that existed on the American task force is going to be degraded 1 level. Just the passage of time, the task force hasn't just been sitting still in the middle of the ocean, it's still moving around. The Soviets don't have as good an idea where it is anymore. And that's a relief for all the sailors on that ship. Now, this scenario does not include what are called RORSATs, but oh, it does. I'm sorry, it has them, but they are not present on the map. You know, I think during scenario setup, I think I was supposed to place one of these. Let me quickly double check and see if I was supposed to place a satellite for the Soviets. I think I was, and they're important. No, it doesn't say that I was supposed to place one ahead of time. So one of the things that the Soviets may do as an action is to spend 2 operation points and launch a satellite into space. If there was a satellite out there, you'll notice that it has one die for detection. So what happens is the Soviets launch it, and they decide which C zone it's going to go in, put it there, and you roll a die. This isn't really happening, I'm just demonstrating. If a 1 or a 2 is rolled, the satellite blows up on the launch pad. In this case, the placement is successful. If this satellite were on the map right now, it would make a detection roll. But it is not present on the map right now. So that's how those satellites work. Those are important units for the Soviets when they're in play. They do a lot of work. And so that is step 3. Rorsats would do their search. Now, step 4 is air unit spent marker removal except for maritime patrol craft. So if any of these fighters here were spent, or if the Soviet strike units had survived and were spent over here, they would now become refreshed. Maritime patrol craft remain spent for the rest of the turn. Okay, sorry. So step 5 would be to resolve fighter versus fighter combat due to the movement of the task force. So if there was an American carrier in this C zone, at this point, the combat air patrol units for each side would fight. The Soviets, Yaks, would probably retreat, and there'd be consequences to that. We'll see about that. And then the 6th step is intrinsic detection units are attacked and then searched. That doesn't apply now. It is going to apply later in the game, so I'm going to talk about that when it happens. For now, I will just say that every carrier unit in the game has what are called intrinsic detection units. So for the Russians, those are Helix helicopters, I think, and for the Americans, those are the what are they? The E-3 Sentries that the carriers fly with the radar dome. So those units then can be attacked by enemy fighters, and if they survive, they can then try to detect task forces. That's for a future thing. I am going to move task forces into the same C zone so you can see how that works, but I'll do it in a separate video. All right. So that is the ship's action. We have finished everything we need to finish for the ship's action. I hope that was clear. I feel like I talk a lot, but you can tell me if you have any questions. Let me know. So I'm going to end the video there just to keep the videos, reasonable length. And at the next video, we'll begin over here on the ops track. The Soviets will now have some choices about things to do. All right. Thanks for following along.